Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Robert Martinez, and I've been a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park for 22 years. What I'm about to tell you happened during what should have been a routine search and rescue operation in September of 2019. But it turned into something that fundamentally changed how I view my job and the people who visit our parks. Before I get into the details of what happened, you need to understand something about working as a ranger in Yellowstone. We're responsible for over 2 million acres of some of the most beautiful and dangerous wilderness in America. On any given day, we might deal with tourists getting too close to bison, hikers lost in sudden snowstorms, or thermal features that can literally cook you alive if you fall in. Most of the time, the dangers are natural ones that come with the territory when you're dealing with genuine wilderness. I grew up in Wyoming, just outside the park boundaries, so I've been familiar with this landscape my entire life. My father worked construction on some of the park roads back in the 70s, and I spent countless weekends as a kid exploring trails that most visitors never see. When I graduated from the University of Wyoming with a degree in natural resource management, becoming a park ranger felt like the natural next step. In my early years on the job, I handled the usual range of incidents that come with managing one of America's most popular national parks. Lost tourists, minor injuries on hiking trails, the occasional bear encounter that required relocating either the bear or the humans. I thought I'd seen everything the job could throw at me. I was wrong. The Johnson case started on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was at the Mammoth Hot Springs Ranger Station completing paperwork when the call came in around 9:30. Patricia Johnson, calling from Denver, was worried because her husband Michael and their adult son David hadn't returned from a planned 3-day backpacking trip. They'd been due back Monday evening, and Patricia said it wasn't like them to be late without calling. Michael Johnson was 62 years old, a recently retired accountant who'd been visiting Yellowstone with his family for over 15 years. Patricia described him as methodical and cautious, the type of person who planned every detail of a trip and always had backup plans. Their son David was 28, an experienced outdoorsman who worked as a wilderness guide in Colorado during the summer months. These weren't inexperienced tourists who might get lost or make poor decisions in the backcountry. According to Patricia, Michael and David had planned to hike the Thoroughfare Trail, one of the most remote sections of Yellowstone. It's a challenging 43-mile round trip that takes hikers deep into the southeastern corner of the park, following the Yellowstone River through some of the most pristine wilderness in the lower 48 states. The trail passes through prime grizzly habitat and requires crossing several creek beds that can become dangerous during periods of heavy rain or snowmelt. Patricia had their complete itinerary. They'd planned to hike in about 12 miles the first day and camp near the Yellowstone River. The second day, they were going to push deeper into the backcountry, possibly reaching the park boundary near Thoroughfare Creek. The third day would be the hike back out to their vehicle. It was an ambitious trip, but well within the capabilities of 2 experienced hikers. I was assigned to lead the search and rescue operation, along with my partner James Sullivan, another senior ranger with extensive backcountry experience. We also had 2 seasonal employees joining us. William Chen, a recent college graduate who'd been working at Yellowstone all summer, and Thomas Blake, a local guy who'd grown up in the area and knew the terrain as well as anyone. We spent Tuesday afternoon studying topographical maps and weather reports, planning our search strategy. The weather had been relatively stable during the Johnsons' planned hiking dates, with no major storms or unusual conditions that might have forced them to seek shelter or change their route. That was both good and bad news. Good because it meant they probably hadn't been caught in a life-threatening weather event. Bad because it meant their failure to return was likely due to an injury, equipment failure, or something else we couldn't immediately identify. Early Wednesday morning, we loaded our gear and drove to the thoroughfare trailhead. The plan was to follow the Johnsons' intended route, checking all the established camping areas and any places where they might have stopped to rest or take shelter. If we didn't find them by evening, we'd call for additional resources, including a helicopter if weather conditions permitted. The thoroughfare trail starts out relatively easy, following an old wagon road through grasslands and scattered timber. But as you get deeper into the backcountry, the terrain becomes more challenging. The trail crosses numerous creek beds, climbs over ridges, and passes through dense forest where visibility is limited. It's the kind of place where you could easily walk within 50 yards of someone and never see them. We made good time for the first several miles, calling out the Johnsons' names and looking for any signs of their passage. The trail was soft from recent rains, perfect for holding footprints, but we weren't seeing any evidence that anyone had hiked this route in the past week. That was our first indication that something might be seriously wrong. Around midday, we reached the area where the Johnsons had planned to make their first night's camp. It's a designated backcountry campsite near the river, with a fire ring and established tent sites, but there was no sign that anyone had camped there recently. No footprints, no food scraps, no evidence of a fire. If the Johnsons had followed their planned itinerary, they should have spent Monday night at this site. Maybe they decided to push further in the first day, William suggested. If they were making good time, they might have wanted to get deeper into the backcountry. It was possible, but it didn't fit with what Patricia had told us about her husband's personality. Michael Johnson was the type of person who stuck to his plans, especially when it came to safety in the wilderness. Changing his itinerary without good reason would have been out of character. We continued deeper into the backcountry, checking every possible camping spot and trail junction. The further we went without finding any trace of the Johnsons, the more concerned we became. By late afternoon, we'd covered nearly 20 miles of trail and hadn't found so much as a footprint or a piece of dropped gear. That evening, we made camp at a backcountry site about 15 miles from the trailhead. James and I discussed our options over dinner. We could call for additional search teams and expand our search area, but the thoroughfare is enormous, and 2 people could easily be hidden anywhere in millions of acres of wilderness. What if they never made it to the trail? Thomas asked. What if something happened to them before they even started hiking? It was a possibility we hadn't considered. Maybe the Johnsons had encountered some kind of problem at the trailhead or during the drive to Yellowstone, but Patricia had confirmed that they'd called her from their hotel in West Yellowstone on Sunday night, telling her they were excited about starting their hike the next morning. Thursday morning, we decided to retrace our steps and search areas we might have missed on the way in. We also called for backup. 2 additional ranger teams and a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging equipment. If the Johnsons were injured and unable to move, the helicopter might be able to spot them from the air. It was William who found the first piece of evidence. We were searching a meadow about 8 miles from the trailhead when he called out that he'd discovered something unusual. About 100 yards off the main trail, partially hidden under some deadfall, was a blue day pack. James and I approached carefully while William and Thomas stayed back to mark the location with GPS. The pack was definitely recent, not something that had been weathering in the elements for months. Inside, we found a water bottle, some energy bars, trail mix, and a wallet belonging to David Johnson. "This doesn't make sense," James said, examining the pack. "Why would they hide their gear?" There was no sign of damage to the pack, no tears or bloodstains that might indicate an animal attack or accident. It looked like it had been deliberately placed under the fallen logs, not dropped or lost during a struggle. We expanded our search pattern around the meadow, looking for any other signs of the Johnsons. That's when Thomas made a discovery that changed everything. About 50 yards from where we'd found the day pack, he spotted something tied to a pine tree about 8 feet off the ground. It was a piece of orange surveyor's tape, but not the kind we use for official Park Service trail marking. This was bright orange plastic ribbon, tied in an elaborate pattern of knots that looked almost decorative. The tape was fresh, recently placed, and it clearly didn't belong in a wilderness area. "Could be hunters," William suggested. "Maybe marking a trail or a blind?" But hunting wasn't allowed anywhere in Yellowstone, and we were still months away from hunting season in the adjacent national forest lands. More concerning was what James discovered when he climbed up to examine the tape more closely. There were similar pieces tied to trees in a rough line heading deeper into the forest, away from any established trail. We had a difficult decision to make. Our primary mission was to find the Johnson family, but following these mysterious markers would take us into dense, unmarked wilderness where we could easily become lost ourselves. If the markers were connected to the missing hikers, we needed to investigate. If they weren't, we could be wasting precious time and resources that should be devoted to the search. I made the call to follow the markers. We left William at the meadow with our radio to maintain communication with headquarters while James, Thomas, and I followed the orange tape deeper into the forest. The markers led us up a steep hillside through increasingly thick vegetation. It was slow, dangerous going, and we had to stop frequently to check our GPS and mark our own route back to safety. After about an hour of difficult hiking through terrain that would challenge even experienced outdoorsmen, the orange markers led us to a small clearing that had obviously been modified by human hands. Trees had been cut down with chainsaws, and the stumps were relatively fresh, probably no more than a few months old. Someone had built a rough shelter using logs and camouflage tarps, and there were the remains of several large campfires scattered around the area. But what immediately caught our attention was what appeared to be some kind of trophy display. Hanging from a rope stretched between 2 trees on the far side of the clearing were pieces of hiking equipment: boots, jackets, pants, backpacks, all hanging like macabre decorations. James was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "Those look like hiking clothes," he said quietly. Thomas started to approach the hanging items, but I stopped him. "Don't touch anything," I ordered. "This is a crime scene." I got on the radio to William and told him to contact headquarters immediately. We needed law enforcement out here, and we needed them fast. While we waited for his response, James and I did a careful visual survey of the clearing without disturbing anything that might be evidence. The longer we looked, the more disturbing details we noticed. The shelter wasn't just a rough camping setup thrown together by weekend warriors. It was well constructed and had obviously been used for an extended period. There were food supplies, cooking equipment, sleeping areas, and what looked like a workshop area with various tools and weapons. Near one of the fire pits, Thomas spotted something that made all of our blood run cold. Partially buried in the ash and dirt were what looked like small bones. We hoped they were animal bones, but they were the wrong size and shape to belong to any large game animals native to the area. William's voice crackled over the radio with a response from headquarters. They were sending additional rangers and had contacted the FBI field office in Salt Lake City. A helicopter was being dispatched, but it wouldn't arrive until the following morning due to weather moving into the area. we were told to secure the area and wait for backup, but not to disturb anything that might be evidence. The three of us took turns keeping watch while the others documented everything we could see with cameras and GPS coordinates. As evening approached, we heard something that made our situation infinitely more complicated and dangerous. The sound of multiple people moving through the forest, heading directly toward our location. We couldn't tell how many individuals were approaching, but they were making no effort to move quietly. Branches were snapping, and we could hear voices, though we couldn't make out what they were saying. The voices were getting closer, and they seemed to be coming from the same direction we'd used to reach the clearing. If these were the people responsible for whatever had happened to the Johnson family, we were potentially walking into a confrontation with killers who had nothing left to lose. I made a quick, tactical decision. We couldn't defend this position if whoever was coming meant us harm, and we couldn't abandon what was clearly a major crime scene. James and Thomas positioned themselves on either side of the clearing where they had clear sight lines and good cover, while I hid behind the makeshift shelter where I could observe whoever entered the clearing. The voices got closer, and finally, two men emerged from the tree line. They were both in their 40s, wearing military-style camouflage clothing, and carrying what appeared to be assault rifles. One was tall and thin, with a scraggly gray beard, while the other was shorter and heavyset with multiple tattoos visible on his arms. They stopped when they saw us and seemed surprised, but not particularly alarmed. Their reaction told me they weren't expecting to find law enforcement in their clearing, but they also weren't panicking or immediately reaching for their weapons. "Well, hello there," the tall one called out in a casual tone. Didn't expect to find park rangers way out here in the middle of nowhere. I stepped out from behind the shelter with my hands visible but ready to reach for my sidearm if necessary. "Good evening," I replied in my most authoritative voice. "I'm Ranger Robert Martinez with the National Park Service. Can I ask what you gentlemen are doing in this area?" The shorter man grinned, showing several missing teeth. "Just camping, officer. This is public land, isn't it? Last time I checked, Americans still had the right to camp on public land." "Actually, you're in Yellowstone National Park," James said, emerging from his position with his hand resting on his weapon. "Backcountry camping requires permits, and this area isn't designated for camping. More importantly, we're investigating the disappearance of two hikers, and this appears to be a crime scene." The two men exchanged a look that I definitely didn't like. The tall one slowly set down his pack, but his movements were controlled and deliberate, like someone who was assessing the tactical situation. "We didn't know anything about missing hikers," the tall man said. "We've been out here for several days, just enjoying the wilderness. Haven't seen anyone else." "Can I see some identification?" I asked, following standard law enforcement protocol. "Sure thing, Ranger," the tall man said, but instead of reaching for his wallet, his hand moved towards something else attached to his belt. That's when I noticed the handle of a large hunting knife and what looked like the grip of a concealed pistol. Everything changed very quickly after that moment. I drew my weapon and ordered both men to put their hands where I could see them. The tall man hesitated for several seconds, and I could see him calculating whether he could reach his weapon before I could react. But Thomas, who had quietly circled around behind them during our conversation, made his presence known by stepping on a branch. Realizing they were surrounded and outgunned by federal law enforcement officers, both men slowly raised their hands. We zip-tied them with plastic restraints from our emergency kit and carefully searched their backpacks and equipment. What we found confirmed our worst fears about what had happened to the Johnson family. The packs contained additional pieces of hiking gear, including items that exactly matched the descriptions Patricia Johnson had given us of her husband and son's equipment. There were also several driver's licenses and credit cards belonging to different people, none of them the two men we'd just arrested. But the most damning evidence was a digital camera containing hundreds of photographs. When James scrolled through the images, his face went white. "We need to get these guys out of here right now," he said grimly. "And we need a full forensics team and the FBI." I didn't look at the camera myself until much later, after everything was over and the suspects were in custody. I wish I never had. The images showed things that no human being should ever have to see. Evidence of torture, murder, and disposal of bodies that included not just the Johnson family but several other victims we hadn't even known were missing. The helicopter arrived the next morning with FBI agents and a team of forensic specialists. Over the following weeks, they conducted the most extensive criminal investigation in Yellowstone's history. What they discovered was evidence of a killing spree that had been going on for over 3 years. The two men we'd arrested were Charles Mason and Anthony Clark, both with extensive criminal records, including previous convictions for assault and weapons violations. But they weren't just random criminals who had decided to start killing people in national parks. They were part of a larger, more organized operation. The investigation revealed that Mason and Clark were working with a network of at least 6 other individuals who had been systematically targeting experienced hikers and backpackers in remote wilderness areas across the western United States. They had operations in multiple national parks and national forests, taking advantage of the vast, isolated terrain to waylay victims who were unlikely to be discovered quickly. Their method was sophisticated and terrifying in its efficiency. They would identify potential victims by monitoring trail registers, camping permits, and social media posts about planned backcountry trips. Then they would position themselves along known hiking routes and follow their targets into remote areas where they could attack without witnesses. The orange surveyor's tape had been their way of marking routes between different camps and burial sites. They had several such locations throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, each one carefully chosen for its remoteness and the low probability of discovery. Charles Mason eventually led investigators to burial sites scattered throughout thousands of acres of wilderness. In total, they found evidence of at least 15 different victims, including families with children, solo hikers, and groups of friends who had simply wanted to experience the beauty of America's national parks. Anthony Clark never fully cooperated with the investigation, but the evidence found at the scene was overwhelming. Both men were convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the case was far from over. The investigation expanded to include other suspected members of their network, leading to arrests in Colorado, Utah, Montana, and Wyoming. It turned out that what we'd discovered wasn't just an isolated incident, but part of a larger criminal enterprise that had been targeting outdoor enthusiasts across multiple states. Patricia Johnson attended every day of both trials. I'll never forget the mixture of relief and profound sadness on her face when the guilty verdicts were read. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back her husband and son or undo the trauma that would affect her for the rest of her life. The case fundamentally changed how Yellowstone approaches visitor safety and law enforcement in the backcountry. We now require all overnight backcountry campers to carry satellite communication devices and check in at designated times. We've also significantly increased ranger patrols in remote areas and established better coordination with law enforcement agencies in adjacent jurisdictions. But the psychological impact on the park staff was enormous and long-lasting. For decades, we'd been telling families that Yellowstone was a safe place to experience wilderness and wildlife. We'd always warned about natural dangers like bears, thermal features, and severe weather, but we'd never imagined that organized criminals were systematically hunting and killing our visitors. The hardest part for me personally was realizing how many opportunities we'd missed to detect this operation earlier. Mason and Clark had been operating in the park for years, and there had been warning signs that we'd either missed or attributed to natural causes. Hikers who were reported missing and never found. Equipment that was discovered in strange locations. Reports of unusual activities in remote areas that were never thoroughly investigated. I've spent countless hours wondering how many lives could have been saved if we'd been more suspicious, more thorough in our investigations, more willing to consider that some disappearances might be the result of foul play rather than accidents. The case also made me realize how vulnerable people become when they venture into truly remote wilderness areas. The Johnson family had done everything right according to all our safety guidelines. They'd filed a detailed itinerary, carried proper equipment, and had extensive wilderness experience. But none of that protected them from predators who were specifically targeting people exactly like them. I still work as a park ranger at Yellowstone, but my approach to the job has changed completely. I'm much more suspicious of people I encounter in remote areas, especially those who seem to be overly interested in the activities of other visitors. I pay closer attention to reports of unusual activities, and I've become an advocate for more aggressive law enforcement presence in backcountry areas. The wilderness will always have natural dangers that we can't completely control. Grizzly bears, extreme weather, difficult terrain, and geological hazards are simply part of the experience when you venture into truly wild places. But the realization that human predators were using our parks as hunting grounds was something none of us had adequately prepared for. What bothers me most is the knowledge that Mason and Clark could have continued their killing spree for years, or even decades, if we hadn't stumbled onto their operation when we did. They were careful, methodical, and they understood how to use the vastness and isolation of wilderness areas to hide their crimes. The families of the victims have filed multiple lawsuits against the National Park Service, claiming that we should have done more to protect visitors and detect the pattern of disappearances sooner. Some of those legal cases are still working their way through the courts, and I understand the anger and frustration behind them. When you visit a national park, you trust that we're doing everything possible to keep you safe. You assume that the greatest dangers come from natural causes, not from fellow human beings who have decided to use our public lands as their personal killing grounds. The Mason-Clark case led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies across the country share information about missing persons in wilderness areas. There's now a national database that specifically tracks disappearances in parks and forests, looking for patterns that might indicate criminal activity rather than accidents or natural causes. We've also dramatically improved our training for recognizing signs that a disappearance might be the result of foul play. Rangers now know to look for specific indicators that might suggest a crime scene has been staged to look like an accident or natural disaster. Perhaps most importantly, we no longer assume that wilderness areas are somehow immune from the same types of violent crime that plague urban areas. We've accepted that national parks can attract people who want to use the isolation and vast terrain to commit crimes, and we've adjusted our procedures and mindset accordingly. I often think about Michael and David Johnson and what their final hours must have been like. They'd come to Yellowstone to spend quality time together as father and son, to experience some of the most beautiful wilderness in America and create positive memories. Instead, they encountered pure evil in a place where they had every right to expect safety and tranquility. Michael Johnson was looking forward to retirement and spending more time in the outdoors with his son. David was building a career as a wilderness guide, sharing his love of nature with others. They were good people who didn't deserve what happened to them, but their deaths weren't meaningless if they help us protect other families from similar fates. The investigation also revealed that Mason and Clark had been escalating their crimes over time. Their early victims had been solo hikers or couples, but they'd gradually moved on to targeting larger groups and families. If we hadn't caught them when we did, there's no telling how many more innocent people they might have killed. I've spoken at law enforcement conferences across the country about the lessons learned from this case. The goal is to help other rangers and police officers recognize similar patterns before they result in multiple victims. Every time I tell this story, I hope it might prevent another family from experiencing the tragedy that befell the Johnsons. The case also highlighted the importance of interagency cooperation and information sharing. Mason and Clark weren't just operating in Yellowstone. They had camps and burial sites in multiple states and jurisdictions. If law enforcement agencies had been sharing information more effectively, their pattern of crimes might have been detected much sooner. Now, there are regular meetings between park rangers, sheriff's deputies, state police, and federal agents who work in our region. We share information about suspicious activities, missing persons reports, and unusual incidents that might be connected to larger patterns of criminal behavior. I want to emphasize that cases like the Mason-Clark murders are extremely rare. Millions of people visit Yellowstone and other national parks every year, and the vast majority have safe, enjoyable experiences that create lifelong positive memories. The statistical chances of encountering violent criminals in the wilderness remain infinitesimally small. But they're not zero, and that's something that both park visitors and law enforcement personnel need to acknowledge and prepare for. We can't let fear keep us out of the wilderness, but we need to be smart and realistic about the full range of potential dangers we might encounter. If you're planning a backcountry trip to any remote area, please take the time to file a detailed itinerary with both park authorities and trusted family members or friends. Carry satellite communication devices or personal locator beacons, especially if you're traveling in areas without cell phone coverage. Stay aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts if something doesn't feel right. And if you're a parent planning to take children into remote wilderness areas, have age-appropriate conversations with them about safety procedures and what to do if they encounter strangers in the backcountry. The vast majority of people you'll meet on trails are fellow outdoor enthusiasts who pose no threat whatsoever, but children should understand the importance of not sharing detailed information about camping plans or routes with people they don't know. Charles Mason and Anthony Clark are exactly where they belong, locked away in maximum security federal prisons where they can never hurt anyone again. The wilderness areas they used as their hunting grounds have been restored and are once again places where families can safely experience the beauty and wonder of nature. But I'll never forget the lesson their crimes taught all of us, that sometimes the greatest dangers in our national parks don't come from bears or storms or difficult terrain. Sometimes they come from fellow human beings who have chosen to use the isolation and beauty of our most treasured landscapes for unspeakably evil purposes. I'm Linda Foster, and I spent 12 years as a park ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington State before I took early retirement in 2022. What I'm going to tell you about happened in November of 2021, during what started as a routine investigation into reports of illegal hunting activities. It ended up being one of the most terrifying experiences of my career, and ultimately the reason I decided I couldn't continue doing this job anymore. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, spending my childhood hiking the trails around Mount Rainier and the Olympic Peninsula with my father, who was a logger before environmental regulations changed the industry. He taught me to love the forest, but he also taught me to respect its dangers. When I became a park ranger after college, I thought I understood what those dangers were: steep terrain, unpredictable weather, aggressive wildlife, and the occasional tourist who made poor decisions. I never imagined that some of the greatest threats would come from my fellow human beings. Olympic National Park covers nearly 1 million acres of some of the most diverse and pristine wilderness in the continental United States. We have temperate rainforests, rugged coastline, and alpine peaks that challenge even experienced mountaineers. It's also remote enough that you can hike for days without seeing another person, which makes it attractive to people who want privacy for activities that might not be entirely legal. During my years at Olympic, I dealt with my share of illegal activities: marijuana growing operations hidden in remote valleys, people cutting firewood in violation of park regulations, and occasional poaching incidents where someone would take a deer or elk without proper permits. Most of these cases were relatively straightforward to handle. You'd find the perpetrators, explain the law, issue citations, and that would be the end of it. But the case that ended my career was different from anything I'd encountered before. It started with reports from several hikers about hearing sustained gunfire in the Hoh River Valley, specifically in a remote section that was well within park boundaries where all hunting is strictly prohibited. The reports had been coming in for about 3 weeks, always from the same general area, and always during daylight hours. What made these reports unusual was the description of the gunfire itself. The hikers who contacted us all mentioned the same thing. The shooting was happening in rapid bursts, like someone was using automatic weapons rather than the single-shot rifles that legal hunters typically use. That was a red flag that suggested we might be dealing with something more serious than simple poaching. My supervisor, Barbara Chen, called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November. She had a stack of incident reports spread across her desk, and her expression was more concerned than I'd seen in years. "Linda, I need you to check out these shooting reports in the Hoh Valley," she said, handing me the file. "This isn't normal hunting activity. The frequency and intensity of the gunfire suggests something else entirely." I spent Friday morning studying topographical maps of the area and planning my approach. The Hoh River Valley is some of the most remote and challenging terrain in the park. It's characterized by old-growth temperate rainforest, steep hillsides covered in thick understory vegetation, and creek beds that can become impassable during periods of heavy rain. The area where the gunshots had been reported was about 15 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by foot trail through terrain that could be treacherous even for experienced hikers. If someone was conducting illegal activities there, they'd chosen their location specifically because it was unlikely to be discovered or investigated. I decided to approach from the south, following an old logging road that had been abandoned decades earlier but would still get me within about 3 miles of the reported shooting location. From there, I'd have to hike cross-country through dense forest, using GPS navigation to reach the area where hikers had heard the gunfire. Saturday morning, I loaded my gear and drove out to the trailhead. I was going in alone, which wasn't ideal from a safety standpoint, but we were short-staffed and I had extensive experience in solo backcountry operations. I carried my standard law enforcement equipment: service weapon, radio, citation book, evidence collection materials, and camera equipment for documenting any violations I might discover. The weather was typical for November in western Washington: overcast skies, temperatures in the low 40s, and a persistent drizzle that made everything slippery and reduced visibility. I started hiking around 8 in the morning, following the old logging road through second-growth forest that was gradually being reclaimed by native vegetation. The first part of the journey was relatively easy, but as I got deeper into the backcountry, the terrain became increasingly challenging. The old road was overgrown with blackberry vines, fallen trees, and young alders that had grown up through the abandoned roadbed. I had to use both hands to push through curtains of wet moss and fern, and visibility was often limited to just 20 or 30 feet in any direction. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached the point where I needed to leave the old road and head cross-country toward the area where the gunshots had been reported. I marked my position with GPS and started into the forest proper, following game trails when I could find them and bushwhacking through thick vegetation when I couldn't. I'd been hiking for about another hour when I heard the first gunshot. It was much closer than I'd expected, probably no more than half a mile away. I stopped and listened carefully, trying to determine the exact direction of the sound. A few seconds later, there was another shot, then another, then a rapid series of shots that confirmed what the hikers had reported. This was definitely automatic weapons fire. The sound was coming from a valley ahead of me, beyond a ridge that I'd have to climb to get a visual on whatever was happening. I moved more carefully now, trying to stay quiet and avoid stepping on fallen branches that might snap and give away my position. As I got closer to the source of the gunfire, I began to smell something that immediately made me uneasy. It was the unmistakable odor of decaying meat, but much stronger and more widespread than what you'd expect from a single animal carcass. The smell was coming from the same direction as the gunshots. I reached the top of the ridge and found a position where I could observe the valley below without exposing myself. What I saw made me realize I was dealing with something far more serious than simple poaching or target practice. In a large clearing that had been carved out of the old-growth forest, there were at least 6 men engaged in what could only be described as military-style training exercises. They were all wearing camouflage clothing and carrying assault rifles, moving through the clearing in tactical formations while firing at various targets. But these weren't standard paper or metal targets used by recreational shooters. They had constructed human-shaped targets using animal carcasses dressed in old clothes, creating disturbingly realistic representations of human beings. The targets were positioned throughout the clearing at various distances and angles, and the men were practicing what appeared to be combat scenarios. The source of the smell I'd noticed earlier was immediately apparent. There were dozens of animal carcasses scattered around the clearing: deer, elk, bears, and other wildlife that had obviously been killed far in excess of what any legitimate hunting party would need. Many of the carcasses were weeks old and badly decomposed, indicating that this operation had been going on for an extended period. But the makeshift targets weren't the most disturbing aspect of what I was observing. These men had constructed an elaborate training facility that included defensive positions, obstacle courses, and what appeared to be a command center housed in military-style tents. This wasn't a group of friends engaging in recreational shooting. This was an organized paramilitary training operation. I used my binoculars to observe the operation for about 30 minutes, trying to understand the scope and nature of what I was seeing. The men below were obviously well-trained and well-equipped. They moved with military precision, communicated using hand signals, and demonstrated familiarity with their weapons that suggested extensive experience. They had vehicles, several trucks and all-terrain vehicles, which explained how they'd been able to transport heavy equipment and supplies to such a remote location. They'd also modified the landscape in ways that would be virtually invisible from any established trail, creating roads and clearings that could only be detected from directly overhead. One of the men appeared to be some kind of instructor or leader, barking orders at the others and critiquing their performance during the training exercises. I heard him use military terminology and references to specific combat situations that suggested these weren't just weekend warriors playing soldier. "Williams, your sector coverage is inadequate," he shouted at one of the trainees. "In a real engagement, that kind of positioning would get your entire squad killed." The man he was addressing, a thin guy wearing glasses under his camouflage cap, nodded and adjusted his position. "Sorry, Sergeant," he replied, using a military rank that made my blood run cold. This wasn't recreational target shooting or even illegal hunting. I was observing what appeared to be a paramilitary training camp where civilians were learning combat tactics and weapons handling. The implications were terrifying, especially given the remote location and the obvious effort they'd put into concealing their activities. I was taking photographs with my camera's telephoto lens when I heard a sound that made me freeze. Footsteps behind me. I turned around slowly and found myself looking at a man in camouflage clothing, pointing an AR-15 rifle directly at my chest. "Don't move," he said quietly. "Put your hands where I can see them and don't make any sudden movements." He was approximately my age, mid-40s, with a full beard and the kind of deep tan that comes from spending extensive time outdoors. He moved with the confidence and alertness of someone who had had professional military training, and his weapon was held in a way that suggested he was very familiar with its use. "I'm a park ranger," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "You're on federal property, and I need to see some identification." "I know exactly who you are and where we are," he interrupted. "The question is what we're going to do about this situation." He gestured for me to stand up and move away from my observation position. As we walked, I noticed that he was wearing some kind of radio headset and was probably in communication with the people in the training camp below. "Command, this is Michael," he said into his radio. "I've got a federal ranger up here on the ridge. Request immediate backup." Within about 15 minutes, I was surrounded by 4 additional men, all armed and all wearing the same type of military-style equipment. One was a woman in her 30s who carried herself with obvious military bearing, and another was an older man who appeared to be some kind of leader based on how the others deferred to him. "What's your name, Ranger?" the older man asked in a tone that was superficially polite but carried an underlying threat. "Linda Foster," I replied. "And you're all under arrest for illegal weapons violations, destruction of federal property, and conducting unauthorized activities in a national park." The older man actually laughed at my attempt to assert law enforcement authority. "I don't think you understand the situation you've walked into, Linda. My name is Robert Williams, and we don't recognize the authority of the federal government over free American citizens." "This is a national park," I said. "It belongs to the American people, not to you or any private group. The American people elected a government that's actively working to destroy the Constitution and eliminate our freedoms," the woman said. "We're preparing to defend ourselves when that government finally shows its true colors." I was beginning to understand that I'd stumbled into something much more dangerous than illegal hunting or even weapons violations. These were anti-government extremists who had established a training facility where they were preparing for what they believed would be an inevitable armed conflict with federal authorities. "Look," I said, trying to find some kind of reasonable middle ground, "I don't want any trouble here. I'm just going to walk back to my vehicle and report what I've observed. You can work out any legal issues with my supervisors." "I'm afraid that's not going to happen," Robert said. "You've seen our operation, our faces, our equipment. We can't allow you to go back and bring the full weight of the federal government down on our people." The woman, who had introduced herself as Patricia, raised her rifle and pointed it directly at me. "We should eliminate this problem right now," she said coldly. "One ranger disappearing in the wilderness won't raise any immediate suspicions." I realized I was in genuine mortal danger. These people weren't just breaking park regulations or even federal weapons laws. They were domestic terrorists who were apparently willing to commit murder to protect their illegal operation. "Before you do anything you'll regret," I said, "you should know that I'm required to check in by radio every 2 hours. If I don't report in on schedule, search teams will come looking for me, and they'll find this place." This wasn't entirely accurate. My check-in schedule wasn't quite that rigid, but I hoped it might make them think twice about killing a federal law enforcement officer. Robert and the others had a quick, whispered conversation among themselves. I could see them weighing their options. Kill me and risk a massive law enforcement response when I was reported missing, or find some other way to deal with the security breach I represented. Finally, Robert turned back to me with what he probably thought was a reasonable proposal. Here's what's going to happen, Linda. You're going to come down to our facility as our guest while we figure out how to resolve this situation without anyone getting hurt. Guest was obviously a euphemism for prisoner, but given the circumstances, I didn't see any alternative. I was outnumbered 5-1, outgunned, and in terrain where they had every conceivable advantage. They escorted me down into the valley and into their training facility. Up close, it was even more elaborate and disturbing than it had appeared from my observation point on the ridge. They'd created a completely self-sufficient operation with everything needed to train a substantial number of people in combat tactics and weapons handling. The facility included multiple shooting ranges set up for different types of training, obstacle courses designed to simulate urban and rural combat environments, and classroom areas where they conducted instruction on topics ranging from explosives handling to surveillance techniques. This wasn't amateur hour. Whoever had designed this operation had extensive knowledge of military training methodology. What bothered me most was discovering that there were children present in the facility. I counted at least 6 kids ranging in age from what looked like elementary school to teenagers, all of whom seemed to accept the presence of weapons and military training as completely normal. They put me in a small building that had obviously been constructed specifically as a holding cell or jail. It had steel bars on the single window, a heavy door that locked from the outside, and minimal furnishing consisting of a cot, a bucket for waste, and a small table. Over the next several hours, I was visited by various members of the group who wanted to interrogate me about Park Service operations and law enforcement procedures. They asked detailed questions about ranger patrol schedules, communication protocols, and how quickly backup would arrive if a ranger went missing or called for assistance. From these conversations, I learned that the group had been operating in Olympic National Park for almost 18 months. They'd started with just 2 families, but had grown to include nearly 30 adults and their children. They considered themselves to be preparing for what they called the coming collapse, when the federal government would impose martial law and attempt to confiscate private firearms. Robert Williams, the apparent leader, had been a career Army officer before retiring and becoming convinced that the federal government was planning to eliminate constitutional rights and establish some kind of authoritarian regime. He'd used his military connections and knowledge to recruit like-minded individuals and establish what he called training centers in remote wilderness areas across multiple states. The group had an elaborate belief system that painted federal law enforcement agencies, environmental regulations, and gun control measures as part of a coordinated attack on American freedom. They saw themselves as modern-day patriots preparing to defend the Constitution against what they believed was an illegitimate government. On my second day as their prisoner, Robert came to my cell for what he described as a frank discussion about our mutual situation. "Linda," he said, "my people are concerned about the security risk you represent. Some of them think we should eliminate you permanently to protect our families and our mission." "I'm just a park ranger doing my job," I replied. "If you release me, I'll recommend that the Park Service work with you to find some kind of legal resolution to this situation." "We both know that's not going to happen," he said. "The federal government doesn't negotiate with groups like ours. They'll send in tactical teams and try to destroy everything we've built here." He was probably right about that. An armed paramilitary group operating illegally in a national park was exactly the kind of situation that would result in a major federal law enforcement response involving multiple agencies. "However," he continued, I think there might be a solution that works for everyone. What if you simply disappeared, not killed, just vanished? Hiking accidents happen all the time in remote wilderness areas. I understood what he was proposing. Cooperate with faking my own death to cover up their operation, or be killed for real to eliminate the security threat I represented. I need time to think about your proposal, I said, stalling for time while I tried to figure out if there was any way to escape or signal for help. You have until tomorrow morning to decide, he replied. That night, I lay awake trying to develop an escape plan. The cell was solidly constructed and constantly guarded, but I noticed that the guards changed shifts at regular intervals. During the shift changes, there were brief periods when the area around my building was less closely monitored. I also realized that my failure to check in would eventually trigger search procedures. When I didn't return to the ranger station as scheduled, Barbara would send teams to look for me. If they found evidence of the paramilitary camp, the situation could escalate into a deadly confrontation. The next morning, Robert returned for my decision. I'd spent the night formulating a plan that I hoped might save my life while also protecting the search teams that would eventually come looking for me. I've decided to cooperate, I told him, but I have conditions. You're not exactly in a position to make demands, he replied. Actually, I am, I said. If you kill me outright, you'll have a murder investigation on your hands. If I simply disappear without a trace, you'll have search teams scouring this area for weeks. But if I help you stage my disappearance convincingly, I can direct the search efforts away from your facility. Robert looked interested despite himself. What exactly are you proposing? I'll help you create a credible accident scene that will make my disappearance look like a hiking mishap, I said. Something that will focus the search efforts on areas far from your training camp. And in return, you allow me to send a message to my family letting them know I'm alive, without revealing my location or what's happening here. And you guarantee that no children will be harmed if law enforcement does eventually discover this place. Robert thought about my proposal for a long time. I could see him weighing the risks and benefits of different approaches to dealing with me. All right, he finally said. We'll try it your way. But if you betray us or try to escape, my people won't hesitate to kill you and anyone who comes looking for you. What happened over the next few days was the most surreal experience of my entire life. I found myself helping a group of domestic terrorists stage my own disappearance to cover up their illegal operation. We hiked to a remote area, several miles from their training facility, and created a scene that would suggest I'd fallen into a fast-moving creek and been swept away by the current. I left behind my radio, ranger hat, and some of my equipment, arranged to look like they'd been dropped during an accidental fall into the water. We even damaged some of my gear and left pieces of my uniform caught on rocks and tree branches near the creek, creating physical evidence that would support the theory that I'd drowned while trying to cross the swollen waterway. Then I returned to their facility as their prisoner, hoping that the search teams would find our planted evidence and conclude that I'd been the victim of a tragic accident, rather than discovering the paramilitary training operation. The deception actually worked, at least initially. When I failed to check in as scheduled, search teams focused their efforts on the area where we'd staged my accident. They found the evidence we'd planted and concluded that I'd probably drowned while attempting to cross the creek during a period of high water. But Robert had underestimated the determination and resources that would be brought to bear in searching for a missing federal law enforcement officer. When my body wasn't recovered after several days of intensive searching, the search area was expanded and additional resources were deployed. On the 8th day of my captivity, we heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching the valley where the training facility was located. Robert's group immediately went into full defensive mode, with armed sentries taking positions around the perimeter of their camp. "This is the United States Park Service," a voice called out from a helicopter equipped with a powerful loudspeaker system. "We know there are people in the area below. We need to establish communication." What followed was an 8-hour standoff between federal negotiators and the armed extremist group. FBI crisis negotiators tried to convince Robert's people to surrender peacefully, while the extremists debated whether to fight, flee, or attempt to negotiate some kind of deal. The presence of children in the compound ultimately made the difference in how the situation was resolved. Robert wasn't willing to risk a firefight that might result in casualties among the kids, and the federal negotiators emphasized that the safety of the children was their primary concern. After hours of tense negotiations conducted via radio and loudspeaker, the group agreed to surrender, in exchange for guarantees that the children would be placed with relatives rather than entering the foster care system, that they would be given opportunities to explain their political beliefs during legal proceedings. I was released unharmed, though I spent several days in the hospital being treated for dehydration, exposure, and the psychological trauma of being held captive by armed extremists who had threatened to kill me. The members of Robert's paramilitary group were arrested on a variety of federal charges, including kidnapping a federal officer, illegal weapons, possession, destruction of federal property, and conspiracy to commit acts of domestic terrorism. The training facility was completely dismantled, and the area was restored as much as possible to its natural condition. However, the environmental damage from 18 months of unauthorized construction and military training activities was extensive and will take years to fully heal. Robert Williams and several other leaders of the group received prison sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. Some of the rank-and-file members received shorter sentences in exchange for cooperating with ongoing investigations into similar groups operating in other locations. The children were indeed placed with family members who weren't involved in the extremist activities, though several of them required extensive counseling to help them adjust to life outside the paramilitary environment where they'd been raised. The experience fundamentally changed how I approached my job as a park ranger, and ultimately led to my decision to retire early. I became much more cautious about working alone in remote areas, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder and questioning the motives of people I encountered in the backcountry. I also developed a much deeper understanding of how national parks and other remote public lands can become refuges for people who reject the authority of the federal government and want to prepare for armed conflict with law enforcement agencies. What bothered me most about the entire experience was realizing that Robert's training facility could have operated in the park for years without being detected if hikers hadn't reported the unusual gunfire. The facility was expertly camouflaged and located in terrain that was rarely visited by park personnel or the general public. This made me wonder how many other illegal operations might be hidden in the millions of acres of remote public land across the United States. How many other extremist groups might be using our national parks and forests as training grounds for domestic terrorism. The incident also made me think about the broader social and political issues that had driven Robert and his followers to such desperate measures. These weren't inherently evil people. They were families who felt that their country was changing in ways they couldn't accept or understand. But instead of working within the democratic system to address their concerns, they'd chosen to prepare for violent conflict with their own government. Their solution put innocent children at risk, destroyed irreplaceable natural resources, and ultimately accomplished nothing except landing them in federal prison. I don't agree with their political beliefs or their methods, but I can understand the sense of powerlessness and fear that led them to abandon civilization and try to create their own society in the wilderness. The tragedy is that their extremist ideology prevented them from finding constructive ways to address their legitimate concerns about government overreach and threats to constitutional rights. If you're someone who spends time in remote wilderness areas, please be aware that you might encounter people who have chosen to live completely outside the law and who may view any contact with federal authorities as an existential threat to their survival. These individuals are often heavily armed, well-trained, and willing to use violence to protect their illegal activities. If you stumble across suspicious installations or activities in remote areas, don't attempt to investigate on your own. Get to safety and report what you've observed to law enforcement as soon as possible. My name is James Sullivan, and I'm a park ranger at Denali National Park in Alaska. I've been working in law enforcement for 24 years, first as a police officer in Anchorage, then as a park ranger for the past 9 years. I thought I'd seen every type of crime and environmental violation during my law enforcement career, but what happened in August of 2020 introduced me to a form of corporate environmental terrorism that most people never hear about, and that threatens the very survival of our most pristine wilderness areas. Growing up in Alaska, I learned early that the relationship between economic development and environmental protection is often complicated and sometimes violent. My father worked in the oil industry on the North Slope, while my mother was a biology teacher who spent her summers working for the Fish and Wildlife Service. I understood from childhood that Alaska's economy depended on extracting natural resources, but I also learned to love the wilderness and wildlife that made our state unique. When I became a park ranger at Denali, I thought my job would primarily involve protecting visitors from the park's natural dangers: grizzly bears, extreme weather, difficult terrain, and the challenges of surviving in true wilderness. I expected to deal with occasional poaching, incidents, illegal camping, and tourists who made poor decisions about wildlife encounters. What I didn't expect was to uncover a criminal conspiracy involving major corporations that were using our national park as an illegal dumping ground for some of the most toxic substances known to science. It started on a Tuesday morning in late August when my supervisor, Susan Martinez, called me into her office with a deeply concerned expression. She had a folder full of photographs and scientific reports spread across her desk, and I could tell immediately that we were dealing with something serious. "James, we've been getting reports from wildlife biologists about massive fish kills in some of the streams in the eastern section of the park," she said, showing me photographs that were genuinely disturbing. "This isn't just a few dead fish. We're talking about complete ecosystem collapse in multiple waterways." The images showed hundreds of dead salmon, trout, and other fish species floating in streams that should have been crystal clear mountain water. But what was most alarming was that many of the fish showed obvious signs of chemical burns and genetic mutations that suggested exposure to extremely toxic substances. The preliminary water tests are showing elevated levels of mercury, lead, cadmium, and several industrial solvents that shouldn't exist anywhere within 100 miles of the park, Susan continued. The contamination levels are so high that they're off the charts for our standard testing equipment. "Could this be natural?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Some kind of geological formation leaching metals into the water?" "That was our first theory," she replied. "But the contamination pattern is too localized and too severe. The chemical signatures match industrial waste products, not natural mineral deposits. Someone has been dumping massive quantities of toxic waste somewhere upstream from these kill zones." She handed me a detailed topographical map with the affected watersheds marked in red. The contamination seemed to be centered around a remote valley system about 20 miles from the nearest road, in an area that saw virtually no visitors because of the extreme difficulty of accessing it. "I need you to get out there and investigate," Susan said. If someone is illegally dumping industrial waste in Denali, we need to find them and stop them immediately. The environmental damage could spread to other watersheds and affect wildlife throughout the entire region. I spent the rest of Tuesday preparing for what I expected to be a multi-day investigation in extremely remote terrain. I loaded my ATV with water testing equipment, sample collection containers, camera gear, GPS units, and enough food and camping supplies for a week in the field. I also packed my standard law enforcement equipment, including my sidearm and radio, though I wasn't anticipating any dangerous confrontations. Environmental crimes are usually committed by corporate executives in boardrooms, not violent criminals operating in the wilderness. The drive to the eastern section of Denali took nearly 4 hours over increasingly rough dirt roads that eventually deteriorated into little more than game trails. I parked at the end of the last passable road and continued on foot, using topographical maps and GPS to navigate toward the contaminated watershed. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when I was still about 5 miles from the affected streams. There was a distinct chemical odor in the air, sharp and acrid like industrial cleaning solvents mixed with something organic and rotting. The smell was strong enough to burn my throat and make my eyes water. As I got closer to the contaminated area, I began to notice other disturbing signs of environmental damage. The vegetation along what should have been pristine mountain streams was yellowed and dying. Trees that should have been healthy and green were showing signs of severe stress, with leaves that were brown and falling despite the fact that it was still midsummer. When I finally reached the main stream that had been showing the highest contamination levels, what I saw was like something out of an environmental nightmare. The water was an unnatural reddish-brown color, with an oily film on the surface that created rainbow patterns in the sunlight. The rocks along the stream bank were stained with what looked like rust and chemical residue. There were no signs of any living aquatic life whatsoever. No fish, no insects, no amphibians, nothing that indicated a healthy stream ecosystem. Even the birds and small mammals that would normally be found near water sources were conspicuously absent. I collected water samples at multiple locations and photographed everything I observed. The contamination was far worse than the initial reports had indicated. This wasn't just localized. Pollution. It was complete environmental devastation affecting miles of stream systems. Following the main stream upstream toward its headwaters, I searched for the source of the contamination. The chemical smell got stronger as I hiked higher into the mountains, and the environmental damage became increasingly severe. After about 6 miles of hiking through what had once been pristine wilderness, I found what I was looking for. Hidden in a remote valley that was completely invisible from any established trail or overlook was the largest illegal dumping operation I'd ever encountered. Someone had constructed an elaborate facility for disposing of industrial waste on a massive scale. There were hundreds of steel drums and concrete containers scattered throughout the valley, many of them leaking their contents into drainage channels that led directly into the stream system. But this wasn't just someone dumping a few containers of waste and leaving. This was a major operation involving heavy machinery, trucks, and obviously significant financial investment. They'd built access roads, storage facilities, and what appeared to be some kind of processing equipment for handling different types of toxic materials. I was taking photographs of the illegal dump site when I heard the sound of vehicles approaching. I quickly moved into the tree line and watched as a convoy of trucks entered the valley, pulling trailers loaded with more chemical containers. 4 men in protective suits and respirators got out of the lead truck and began unloading the trailers with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. They worked systematically, stacking new containers in organized rows and using specialized equipment to puncture holes in older containers to accelerate the drainage process. The fact that they were wearing full protective equipment told me they understood exactly how dangerous the materials they were handling were. They weren't ignorant about the environmental and health risks. They simply didn't care about the consequences of their actions. One of the men, a heavy-set individual who appeared to be supervising the operation, pulled out a clipboard and began checking off items as they were unloaded. The systematic nature of the operation suggested this was a regular, ongoing business rather than a one-time disposal of waste materials. "Make sure those new drums drain into the main channel," the supervisor called out to his workers. "Corporate wants this site cleared out completely before the next shipment arrives." They were deliberately accelerating the contamination process to make room for additional waste. This wasn't just illegal dumping. It was environmental terrorism being carried out on an industrial scale for profit. I used my camera's telephoto lens to photograph the license plates on the trucks and get clear images of the workers' faces when they removed their protective masks. I also took detailed photos of the chemical containers and their labels, which would be crucial evidence for building a criminal case. After about 2 hours, the men finished unloading their cargo and climbed back into their trucks. But before leaving, the supervisor made a phone call that I was able to overhear from my hiding place. "Yeah, it's Thompson," he said loudly enough for me to hear. "We just finished the August delivery to Site 7. The valley can probably handle 2 more major shipments before we need to relocate the operation." There was a pause while he listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. "I don't care what the contract specifies," he continued. "This location is becoming too contaminated even for our purposes. The entire drainage system is going to be a dead zone within 6 months. We need to find a new dumping site or start reducing the volume of materials." Another pause. "Fine, but after the October shipment, we're done with this location. Find somewhere else to dump this stuff because I'm not risking a federal investigation if someone discovers what we've been doing here." He ended the call and said something to his workers that I couldn't hear clearly. Then the convoy drove away, leaving behind the worst environmental crime scene I'd ever witnessed. I waited until I was certain they were gone before approaching the dump site for a closer inspection. What I found was even worse than what I'd observed from a distance. Some of the containers were labeled with the names and logos of major corporations, chemical companies, electronics manufacturers, medical device firms, and pharmaceutical companies. This wasn't just local environmental crime. Companies from across the United States were paying to have their most toxic waste illegally dumped in one of America's most pristine national parks. The scale of the operation suggested that millions of gallons of industrial waste had been disposed of in this single location over a period of years. I collected soil samples from around the most heavily contaminated areas and gathered pieces of the container labels as evidence. The chemical fumes were overwhelming, even with the wind blowing the vapors away from me. After just 30 minutes of working in the contaminated area, I was feeling dizzy and nauseous from the exposure. I needed to get out of the contaminated zone immediately and call for federal law enforcement backup. This was far beyond the scope of what a single park ranger could or should handle alone. I hiked back to where I'd left my ATV and tried to contact headquarters by radio, but I was too far from any relay stations for reliable communication. I'd have to drive back toward civilization before I could report what I'd discovered. The drive back seemed to take forever. I kept thinking about the scale of environmental destruction I'd witnessed and trying to understand how an operation like that could exist without being detected by federal authorities. The dump site represented years of systematic planning and execution by people who obviously had substantial financial resources and sophisticated knowledge of how to avoid detection. When I finally got within radio range of park headquarters, I contacted Susan immediately. "I need to speak with you privately as soon as possible," I said, "and we need to contact the EPA, FBI, and Department of Justice immediately." "What did you find out there?" she asked. "Susan, this is the largest environmental crime I've ever seen. We're talking about an operation that's destroying entire ecosystems and probably represents violations of dozens of federal environmental laws. We need federal law enforcement and environmental specialists here immediately." There was a long pause before she responded. "Come straight back to headquarters. Don't discuss what you found with anyone else until we can figure out how to handle this properly." When I arrived at the ranger station, Susan was waiting with 3 men I didn't recognize. They introduced themselves as Special Agent Michael Torres from the FBI Environmental Crime Unit, Doctor, William Chen from the EPA Criminal Investigation Division, and Assistant U.S. Attorney David Johnson from the Alaska District. "Ranger Sullivan," Agent Torres said, "we understand you've discovered what appears to be a major illegal dumping operation in the park. We need to see everything you documented and hear a complete account of what you observed." I showed them the photographs and described in detail everything I'd witnessed. Dr. Chen's expression grew more grave with each image I showed him. "This represents one of the worst cases of environmental terrorism I've seen in 20 years with the EPA," he said. "Some of these chemicals are so toxic that even brief exposure can cause permanent organ damage and cancer. The environmental impact will persist for decades, possibly centuries." Agent Torres studied the photos of the workers and vehicles I'd photographed. "We need to identify these individuals immediately and track down the corporations that are paying for this dumping operation. This is organized crime on a massive scale." Over the next week, a joint task force of federal agents, environmental specialists, park rangers, and hazmat teams conducted the most extensive environmental crime investigation in Alaska's history. What they discovered exceeded even my worst fears about the scope of the operation. The illegal dumping had been going on for over 4 years, during which time an estimated 2 million gallons of toxic waste had been disposed of in multiple locations throughout the remote wilderness areas of Denali, cheap alternatives to proper hazardous waste treatment and disposal. Instead of paying the high costs of legitimate waste management, these companies were paying a fraction of the cost to have their most dangerous waste products dumped in national parks and other protected wilderness areas. The man I'd observed supervising the dumping operation was Thomas Richardson, a former environmental engineer who had been fired from his previous job for falsifying safety reports. His partner in the operation was Christopher Davis, who had a long criminal history including previous convictions for environmental crimes in other states. But Richardson and Davis were just the operational leaders. The real targets of the investigation were the corporate executives who had hired them and the organized crime figures who had financed the illegal dumping operation. The FBI's investigation eventually led to criminal charges in 8 different states. Executives from major chemical companies, electronics manufacturers, and pharmaceutical firms were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. Several received substantial prison sentences, though in my opinion, the penalties were nowhere near severe enough for the environmental damage they had caused. The cleanup operation took over 3 years and cost more than $80 million in federal funds. Even with that massive investment, Dr. Chen told me that some areas of the park might never fully recover from the contamination. Hundreds of thousands of fish were killed, along with countless other wildlife species that depended on the contaminated water sources. The economic impact on Alaska's fishing industry was estimated at over $200 million, as contamination fears forced the closure of several important salmon runs. But what troubled me most about the entire case was learning how common this type of environmental crime actually is. According to the EPA, illegal dumping of toxic waste in remote public lands costs billions of dollars in environmental damage every year, and represents a growing threat to some of America's most pristine wilderness areas. The Arctic Disposal Solutions case was just one operation in one national park. According to federal investigators, there are probably dozens of similar criminal enterprises operating right now in remote areas across the country, using our public lands as dumping grounds for the most dangerous waste products of industrial society. I remained involved in the investigation and cleanup efforts, but the experience fundamentally changed how I view my responsibilities as a park ranger. I used to think my primary job was protecting wilderness areas from careless visitors and natural disasters. Now, I understand that some of the greatest threats to our parks come from corporate criminals who see public lands as convenient places to hide their most serious crimes. The case also made me angry in a way I'd never experienced during my law enforcement career. Drug dealers and bank robbers are clearly criminals, but these were wealthy, educated corporate executives who knew exactly what they were doing and simply didn't care about the consequences. They were willing to destroy irreplaceable wilderness ecosystems to increase their profit margins by a few percentage points. I now spend a significant portion of my time specifically looking for signs of illegal dumping and other environmental crimes during my regular patrols. Since the Arctic disposal case, I've discovered 3 smaller illegal dumping operations, and each time I feel the same mixture of anger and determination to hold the criminals accountable. But I also feel frustrated and helpless sometimes. For every illegal dump site we discover and clean up, how many others are operating undetected in remote wilderness areas? How much irreversible environmental damage has already been done to places that are supposed to be protected forever for future generations? The Arctic disposal case taught me that being a park ranger in the 21st century isn't just about protecting wildlife and helping visitors enjoy natural beauty. Sometimes it means going up against powerful corporate interests that see our most treasured landscapes as nothing more than convenient disposal sites for their toxic waste. Richardson and Davis both received lengthy federal prison sentences, and several of the corporate executives who hired them also served time in federal prison. But the environmental damage they caused will persist long after they're released and forgotten. The contaminated areas of Denali have been closed to public access indefinitely, and will require ongoing monitoring and treatment for decades to come. Entire ecosystems that took thousands of years to develop were destroyed in just a few years by people who were motivated by nothing more than greed and complete disregard for environmental consequences. My name is Daniel Rodriguez, and I've been a park ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 17 years. The story I'm about to tell you happened in March of 2018, but it fundamentally changed how I approach my job and how I think about the potential dangers that exist in our most remote wilderness areas. What started as a routine patrol to investigate reports of unauthorized activities turned into an encounter with people who had essentially declared war on the federal government and established their own fortress in the heart of America's most visited national park. I grew up in eastern Tennessee, just outside the boundaries of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So, I've been familiar with these mountains and forests my entire life. My grandfather worked for the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression, helping to build some of the trails and facilities that visitors still use today. My father was a logger before the creation of the park put an end to commercial timber operations in the area. When I decided to become a park ranger after college, it felt like I was continuing a family tradition of working in these mountains, but now focused on protection and preservation rather than resource extraction. I thought I understood the history and culture of the region, including the complicated relationship that some local residents have with federal land management agencies. The southern Appalachian Mountains have always attracted people who want to live independently, away from government oversight and social conventions. During my years as a ranger, I'd encountered illegal moonshine operations, marijuana-growing plots, and occasional squatters who'd built unauthorized cabins in remote areas. Most of these situations were handled quietly and peacefully. The people involved weren't usually violent or dangerous. They were just trying to make a living or live their lives without government interference. A conversation about park regulations and the legal consequences of their activities was usually enough to resolve the situation. But the case I'm about to describe was different from anything I'd encountered before. These weren't just people trying to avoid government oversight. They were actively preparing for armed conflict with federal authorities, and had turned a remote section of our national park into their personal military compound. It started on a Wednesday morning in early March when my supervisor, Mary Williams, called me into her office to discuss some unusual reports that had been coming in from other rangers and park visitors. Over the past several weeks, people had been reporting sounds of construction activity, smoke from large fires, and evidence of tree cutting in an area called Cataract Falls, which is about 15 miles from the nearest road and accessible only by foot trail. "I need you to hike in there and find out what's going on," Mary told me, handing me a file containing the incident reports. Could be illegal camping, could be someone building an unauthorized structure. Either way, we need to know what we're dealing with. The Cataract Falls area is some of the most remote and rugged terrain in the park. It's a deep valley surrounded by steep ridges, with dense old-growth forest and limited visibility. The terrain is so challenging that we rarely patrol there except in response to specific incidents or emergencies. It's also an area with a complicated history. Before the creation of the national park in the 1930s, there had been several small communities in the valley, including a few families who had resisted the federal government's efforts to purchase their land. Some of those families had been forcibly relocated, creating resentments that persisted for generations. I spent Wednesday afternoon studying topographical maps and planning my approach to the area. I decided to hike in from the north, following an old logging road that would get me within about 3 miles of Cataract Falls. From there, I'd have to follow game trails and navigate by compass and GPS through dense forest. Thursday morning, I loaded my pack with law enforcement equipment, camping gear, and enough supplies for 3 days in the field. The plan was to hike in, assess whatever activities were taking place, and report back with my findings. If I found evidence of serious illegal activity, I'd call for backup before taking any enforcement action. The weather was typical for March in the Smokies. Cool temperatures, overcast skies, and patches of fog that reduced visibility to just a few dozen yards in some areas. I started hiking around 7 in the morning, following the old logging road through second-growth forest that was just beginning to show signs of spring. For the first few miles, the hiking was relatively easy, but as I got deeper into the backcountry, the terrain became increasingly difficult. The old road was overgrown with rhododendron thickets and blocked by fallen trees. I had to use both hands to push through dense vegetation, and my progress slowed to less than a mile per hour. About 3 hours into the hike, I started to notice signs that someone had been using the trail recently. Boot prints in muddy areas, broken branches that had been cut rather than naturally broken, and what looked like tire tracks from some kind of all-terrain vehicle. The tire tracks were particularly concerning, because motor vehicles aren't allowed on any trails in this area of the park. Someone had either brought in ATVs illegally or had somehow managed to drive larger vehicles where no roads should exist. As I got closer to the Cataract Falls area, I began to hear sounds that didn't belong in the wilderness. The whining of chainsaws, the rumble of heavy machinery, and voices calling out what sounded like military-style commands. I also started to smell smoke, Not the light smoke from a campfire, but the heavy smoke that comes from burning large quantities of wood and other materials. I left the main trail and climbed to higher ground, hoping to get a view of the valley below before I was spotted by whoever was responsible for the activities I was hearing. What I saw when I reached a good observation point made me realize I was dealing with something far more serious than illegal camping or unauthorized construction. Someone had built what could only be described as a fortified compound in the valley below. There were multiple log buildings, a large cleared area that looked like a military parade ground, and what appeared to be defensive positions and observation posts around the perimeter of the settlement. I counted at least 20 people moving around the compound, all wearing military-style clothing, and many carrying what appeared to be assault rifles. They had several vehicles, trucks, ATVs, and what looked like a military surplus Humvee, which explained the tire tracks I'd seen on the trail. But what really made my blood run cold was the sight of children in the compound. I could see several kids ranging in age from what looked like toddlers to teenagers, playing in a fenced area near one of the buildings. This wasn't just an illegal hunting camp or weapons cache. This was a community of families who had decided to live completely outside the law. Using my binoculars, I observed the compound for about an hour, trying to understand the scope and nature of what I was seeing. The people below were obviously well organized and well equipped. They had solar panels for electricity, gardens for growing food, and storage buildings that probably contained weapons, ammunition, and supplies. They'd also made extensive modifications to the landscape that would be invisible from any established trail. They'd cut down trees to create clear fields of fire around their defensive positions, built roads for their vehicles, and constructed what looked like guard towers on some of the surrounding ridges. This wasn't a group of weekend survivalists playing at being soldiers. These people had invested serious time, money, and effort into creating a permanent, self-sufficient settlement in one of the most remote areas of the park. And they'd done it all without being detected by park authorities. I was taking photographs with a telephoto lens when I heard a sound that made me freeze. Footsteps behind me. I turned around slowly and found myself looking at a man in camouflage clothing, pointing an AR-15 rifle at my chest. "Don't move a muscle," he said quietly. "Put your hands where I can see them and don't try anything stupid." He was about my age, mid-40s, with a graying beard and the kind of weathered appearance that comes from spending a lot of time outdoors. He moved with obvious military training and held his weapon with the confidence of someone who was very familiar with its use. "I'm a park ranger," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and authoritative. "You're on federal property, and I need to see some identification. I know exactly who you are and where we are," he replied. "The question is what we're going to do about this situation." He motioned for me to stand up and move away from my observation position. As we walked, I noticed that he was wearing some kind of radio headset and was communicating with people in the compound below. "Base, this is Michael," he said into his radio. "I've got a federal ranger up here on the North Ridge, requesting immediate backup and instructions." Within about 20 minutes, I was surrounded by 4 additional people, 2 men and 2 women, all armed and all wearing military-style equipment. One of the women appeared to be some kind of medic, based on the medical supplies attached to her gear. The other woman looked like she had military or law enforcement training based on how she carried herself and positioned her weapon. The apparent leader of the group was an older man who introduced himself as Robert Williams. He was probably in his late 50s, with gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd held command positions in the military. "What's your name, Ranger?" he asked in a tone that was superficially polite, but carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. "Daniel Rodriguez," I replied. and you're all under arrest for illegal camping, weapons violations, and destruction of federal property." Robert actually laughed at my attempt to assert law enforcement authority. "I don't think you understand the situation you've walked into, Daniel. We don't recognize the authority of the federal government over free American citizens. This is a national park," I said. "It belongs to the American people, and you're violating dozens of federal laws by being here. The American people elected a government that's systematically destroying the Constitution and preparing to impose tyranny on law-abiding citizens," one of the women said. "We're not going to stand by and let that happen to our families." I was beginning to understand that I'd stumbled into something much more dangerous than simple trespassing or weapons violations. These were anti-government extremists who had established what they considered to be a free territory in the wilderness, and they were apparently prepared to use violence to defend it. "Look," I said, trying to find some kind of middle ground that might diffuse the situation. "I don't want any trouble here. I'm just going to walk back to my vehicle and report what I've observed. You can work out any legal issues with my supervisors and federal authorities." "I'm afraid that's not going to happen," Robert said. "You've seen our community, our defenses, our capabilities. We can't allow you to go back and bring the full weight of the federal government down on our families." One of the men, who hadn't spoken until now, stepped forward with what looked like plastic zip ties in his hands. "We should restrain him and take him down to the compound," he said. "We can figure out what to do with him later." "Wait," I said, realizing that the situation was about to escalate beyond my ability to control it. "Before you do anything you'll regret, you should know that I'm required to check in by radio every few hours. If I don't report in on schedule, search teams will come looking for me, and they'll find this place." This wasn't entirely accurate. My check-in requirements weren't quite that rigid, but I hoped it might make them reconsider taking me prisoner or worse. Robert and the others had a quick, whispered conversation among themselves. I could see them weighing their options. Let me go and risk exposure of their operation, take me prisoner and risk a federal investigation when I was reported missing, or eliminate me permanently and hope my disappearance would be attributed to a hiking accident. "Here's what's going to happen, Daniel," Robert finally said. "You're going to come down to our community as our guest while we figure out how to resolve this situation without anyone getting hurt." Guest was obviously a euphemism for prisoner, but given that I was outnumbered, outgunned, and in terrain where they had every conceivable advantage, I didn't see any alternative to cooperating. They escorted me down into the valley and into their compound. Up close, it was even more impressive and disturbing than it had appeared from the ridge. They'd created a completely self-sufficient community with everything needed to support about 30 adults and their children for extended periods. The compound included multiple residential buildings, workshops, food storage facilities, a medical clinic, and even a school where the children received education that apparently focused heavily on survival skills and anti-government ideology. They had their own water supply, electrical generation, and communication systems. What bothered me most was seeing how the children seemed to accept the presence of weapons and military-style training as completely normal. These kids were growing up in an environment where armed confrontation with law enforcement was considered inevitable and necessary. They put me in a small building that had obviously been constructed specifically as a holding cell or jail. It had bars on the single window, a heavy door that locked from the outside, and minimal furnishing consisting of a cot, a bucket, and a small table. Over the next several hours, I was visited by various members of the group who wanted to question me about Park Service operations and law enforcement procedures. They asked detailed questions about ranger patrol schedules, communication protocols, response times for backup, and the types of equipment and weapons that park rangers carry. From these conversations, I learned that the group had been living in the park for almost 2 years. They'd started with just a few families, but had grown to include nearly 40 adults and children. They considered themselves to be preparing for what they called the Second American Revolution, when patriots would be forced to take up arms against a tyrannical federal government. Robert Williams, the apparent leader, had been a career Army officer before retiring and becoming convinced that the federal government was planning to confiscate private firearms and impose martial law. He'd used his military connections and knowledge to recruit like-minded individuals and establish what he called liberty communities in remote wilderness areas. The group had an elaborate ideology that portrayed federal agencies, environmental regulations, and gun control measures as part of a coordinated attack on constitutional rights. They saw themselves as modern-day patriots preparing to defend America against what they believed was an illegitimate government. On my second day as their prisoner, Robert came to my cell for what he described as a serious conversation about our mutual problem. "Daniel," he said, "my people are very concerned about the security risk you represent. Some of them believe we should eliminate you permanently to protect our families and our mission." "I'm just a park ranger doing my job," I replied. "If you release me unharmed, I'll recommend that the Park Service work with you to find some kind of legal resolution to this situation." "We both know that's not going to happen," he said. "The federal government doesn't negotiate with groups like ours. They'll send in tactical teams and try to destroy everything we've built here." He was probably right about that. An armed anti-government group living illegally in a national park was exactly the kind of situation that would result in a major federal law enforcement response involving multiple agencies and military-style tactics. "However," he continued, "I think there might be a solution that works for everyone involved. What if you simply disappeared? Not killed necessarily, just vanished without a trace. Hiking accidents happen all the time in remote wilderness areas." I understood what he was proposing. Cooperate with staging my own disappearance to cover up their operation, or be killed for real to eliminate the security threat I represented. "I need time to think about your proposal," I said, stalling for time while I tried to figure out if there was any way to escape or signal for help. "You have until tomorrow morning to give me your decision," he replied. That night, I lay awake, trying to develop some kind of escape plan. The cell was solidly constructed, and there were armed guards outside 24 hours a day. Even if I could somehow get out of the building, I'd have to cross the compound and then navigate miles of wilderness while being pursued by people who knew the terrain much better than I did. But I also knew that my failure to return as scheduled would eventually trigger search procedures. When I didn't check in at park headquarters, Mary would send teams to look for me along my planned route. If they found evidence of the armed compound, the situation could escalate into a deadly confrontation. The next morning, Robert returned for my decision. I'd spent the night formulating a plan that I hoped might save my life, while also protecting the search teams that would eventually come looking for me. "I've decided to cooperate," I told him, "but I have some conditions." "You're not exactly in a position to make demands," he replied. "Actually, I am," I said. "If you kill me outright, you'll have a murder investigation and massive law enforcement response. If I simply disappear without explanation, you'll have search teams scouring this area for weeks. But if I help you stage my disappearance convincingly, I can direct the search efforts away from your compound." Robert looked interested despite his obvious skepticism. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'll help you create a believable accident scene that will make my disappearance look like a solo hiking mishap," I said. "Something that will focus search efforts on areas far from your community. And in return?" You allow me to contact my family to let them know I'm alive without revealing my location or situation, and you guarantee that none of the children in your community will be harmed if law enforcement does eventually discover this place." Robert thought about my proposal for a long time. I could see him weighing the risks and benefits of different approaches to dealing with me. "All right," he finally said. "We'll try it your way, but if you betray us or attempt to escape, my people won't hesitate to kill you and anyone who comes looking for you." What happened over the next few days was the most surreal experience of my entire life. I found myself helping a group of anti-government extremists stage my own disappearance to cover up their illegal settlement. We hiked to a remote area several miles from their compound and created a scene that would suggest I'd fallen from a cliff while trying to photograph a waterfall. I left behind my radio, ranger hat, and some of my equipment, arranged to look like they'd been dropped during an accidental fall. We even damaged some of my gear and scattered pieces of my uniform on rocks below the cliff, creating physical evidence that would support the theory that I'd fallen to my death in an area where my body might never be recovered. Then, I returned to their compound as their prisoner, hoping that the search teams would find our planted evidence and conclude that I'd been the victim of a tragic accident rather than discovering the armed settlement. The deception worked initially. When I failed to check in as scheduled, search teams focused their efforts on the area where we'd staged my accident. They found the evidence we'd planted and concluded that I'd probably fallen to my death while working alone in a dangerous area. But Robert had underestimated the determination and resources that would be brought to bear in searching for a missing federal law enforcement officer. When my body wasn't recovered after several days of intensive searching, the search area was expanded and additional resources were deployed. On the 7th day of my captivity, we heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters approaching the valley where the compound was located. Robert's group immediately went into full defensive mode, with armed guards taking positions throughout their defensive perimeter. "This is the United States Park Service," a voice called out from a helicopter equipped with a loudspeaker system. "We know there are people in the valley below. We need to establish communication." What followed was a tense 8-hour standoff between federal negotiators and the armed extremist group. FBI crisis negotiators tried to convince Robert's people to surrender peacefully, while the extremists debated whether to fight, attempt to flee, or try to negotiate some kind of deal. The presence of children in the compound ultimately determined how the situation was resolved. Robert wasn't willing to risk a firefight that might result in casualties among the kids, and the federal negotiators made it clear that the safety of the children was their primary concern. After hours of difficult negotiations conducted via radio and loudspeaker, the group agreed to surrender in exchange for guarantees that the children would be placed with relatives rather than entering the foster care system, and that all adults would have opportunities to explain their political beliefs during legal proceedings. I was released unharmed, though I spent several days in the hospital being treated for dehydration, minor injuries, and the psychological effects of being held captive by people who had threatened to kill me. The members of Robert's anti-government group were arrested on a variety of federal charges, including kidnapping a federal officer, illegal weapons possession, destruction of federal property, conspiracy, and various violations of federal land use regulations. The compound was completely dismantled over the following weeks, and the area was restored as much as possible to its natural condition. However, the environmental damage from 2 years of unauthorized construction and occupation was extensive, and will take many years to fully heal. Robert Williams and several other leaders of the group received prison sentences ranging from 12 to 20 years. Some of the rank-and-file members received shorter sentences in exchange for cooperating with ongoing investigations into similar groups operating in other locations. The children were indeed placed with family members who weren't involved in the extremist activities, though several required extensive counseling to help them adjust to life outside the militaristic environment where they'd been raised. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach my job as a park ranger and my understanding of the potential threats that exist in remote wilderness areas. I'm much more cautious about working alone in backcountry areas, and I pay closer attention to reports of unusual activities or unauthorized access to remote locations. I also have a much deeper appreciation for how easily our national parks can become refuges for people who reject the authority of the federal government and want to establish their own societies outside the law. The vast, remote wilderness areas that make our parks so special also make them attractive to people who want to hide from law enforcement. What bothered me most about the entire experience was realizing that Robert's compound could have operated in the park for years without being detected if visitors hadn't reported unusual sounds and activities. The location was expertly chosen and well concealed, and the group had obviously put considerable thought into avoiding detection. This made me wonder how many other illegal settlements might exist in the millions of acres of remote public land across the United States. How many other extremist groups might be using our national parks and forests as bases for preparing for armed conflict with the government. The incident also made me think about the broader social and political issues that had driven Robert and his followers to such extreme measures. These weren't inherently evil people. They were families who felt that their country was changing in ways they couldn't accept, and who had lost faith in democratic institutions. But instead of working within the system to address their concerns, they'd chosen to abandon society and prepare for violent conflict. Their solution put innocent children at risk, destroyed irreplaceable natural resources, and ultimately accomplished nothing except landing them in federal prison. I don't agree with their political beliefs or their methods, but I can understand the sense of powerlessness and alienation that led them to seek refuge in the wilderness. The tragedy is that their extremist ideology prevented them from finding constructive ways to participate in democratic society. The case also highlighted the challenges that law enforcement faces in dealing with anti-government extremists who are willing to use violence to protect their illegal activities. These aren't ordinary criminals motivated by profit. They're true believers who see any interaction with federal authorities as an existential threat to their survival. If you're someone who spends time in remote wilderness areas, please be aware that you might encounter people who have chosen to live completely outside the law and who may view any contact with outsiders as a security threat. These individuals are often heavily armed, well-trained, and operating under ideologies that justify violence against government representatives. Trust your instincts, avoid confrontation, and report suspicious activities to park authorities as soon as possible. The isolation that makes wilderness areas so appealing for recreational purposes also makes them attractive to people who want to hide illegal activities from law enforcement. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I've been a park ranger at Glacier National Park in Montana for 13 years. The case I'm about to describe happened in October of 2019, and it's the reason I now carry a satellite communicator on every patrol, even for routine duties. What started as a welfare check on some overdue campers turned into the discovery of a crime scene that fundamentally changed how I think about human nature and the potential for evil that can exist in the most beautiful places on Earth. I grew up in northwestern Montana, so I've been familiar with this landscape my entire life. My father was a hunting guide who taught me to track animals and survive in backcountry conditions. My mother was a nurse who instilled in me a desire to help people. When I became a park ranger after college, I thought I understood what the job would involve: protecting visitors from natural hazards, educating people about wilderness safety, and preserving one of America's most treasured landscapes. Most of the dangers we deal with at Glacier are natural ones. Every year, we respond to accidents involving falls from cliffs, hypothermia cases, bear encounters, and hikers who get lost in areas where a wrong turn can mean the difference between life and death. I never imagined that some of the most disturbing cases I'd handle would involve crimes committed by human beings against other human beings. It started on a Friday afternoon in mid-October when I got a call from our dispatch center. A woman named Barbara Mitchell had contacted the park because her sister's family hadn't returned from their planned camping trip and weren't answering their cell phones. The family, Susan Mitchell, her husband Charles, and their 2 teenage children, Michael and Patricia, had been due back that morning but hadn't shown up at home or contacted anyone. They're extremely reliable people, Barbara told me when I called her back for more details. Susan always calls me the minute they get home from any trip. Something's definitely wrong. The Mitchell family had reserved a backcountry campsite at Lake McDonald for 4 nights. According to Barbara, they were experienced campers who'd been visiting Glacier for over 12 years, always staying in the same general area and following very predictable routines. She said they'd never been late returning from a camping trip, not even by a few hours. I drove out to the Lake McDonald area that afternoon and hiked the 3 miles to their reserved campsite to see if they'd simply decided to extend their stay. What I found there immediately told me this wasn't a case of campers who'd lost track of time. The campsite looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of normal activities. Their large family tent was still set up, but the rainfly was hanging loose and flapping in the wind. Personal belongings were scattered around the site in a way that suggested the family had left suddenly and unexpectedly. There were clothes hanging on a makeshift clothesline, food items left out on their camp table, and camping equipment scattered around the site as if people had just walked away in the middle of daily routines. But what really caught my attention was their vehicle, which was still parked at the trailhead where they'd left it 4 days earlier. I found Charles Mitchell's wallet in their tent, along with Susan's purse and both teenagers' cell phones. Their car keys were also in the tent, which meant that whatever had happened to them, they'd left without taking any of their essential personal items. I radioed headquarters and reported what I'd found. Within 2 hours, I was joined by my supervisor, William Garcia, and 3 other rangers. We conducted a thorough search of the area around the campsite, looking for any trace of where the family might have gone. That's when Thomas Anderson made a discovery that immediately escalated the seriousness of the situation. About a 1/4 mile from the campsite, he found a piece of fabric caught on a tree branch. It was torn from a child's jacket, and there were several drops of what looked like dried blood on the material. "This doesn't look good," William said when we showed him the fabric. "We need to call in a full search and rescue operation immediately." Over the next 3 days, more than 40 searchers combed the wilderness around Lake McDonald. We had search dogs, helicopters when weather permitted, and teams of volunteers from the local mountain rescue organization. But despite covering hundreds of square miles of terrain, we found no additional trace of the Mitchell family. On the 4th day of the search, I was assigned to check some of the more remote areas that hadn't been thoroughly covered. I was working alone, following Avalanche Creek upstream from the lake, when I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden under a pile of fallen logs about 4 miles from the Mitchell family's campsite, in an area that would be almost impossible to find unless you were specifically looking for it, was what appeared to be a makeshift grave. Someone had dug a shallow pit and covered it with rocks and debris, but recent rains had washed away some of the covering material. I could see what looked like human remains, and pieces of clothing that matched the descriptions we'd been given of what the Mitchell family was wearing when they disappeared. I immediately radioed for backup and secured the scene without disturbing anything that might be evidence. What the forensic team discovered over the following days was even worse than I'd feared. All 4 members of the Mitchell family had been murdered. Based on the evidence at the scene, it appeared they'd been killed somewhere else, and then their bodies had been transported to this remote location for burial. But the most horrifying discovery came when the investigators expanded their search of the burial area. Using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they found evidence of additional graves in the surrounding area, some of which appeared to be much older than the Mitchell family's burial site. "We're looking at a serial killer," FBI Special Agent Robert Davis told our team during one of the briefings. "Someone who's been using this remote area to dispose of victims for what could be several years." The investigation revealed that the Mitchell family had probably been abducted from their campsite and killed elsewhere before being brought to the burial ground. The killer had made some effort to clean up the campsite and make it look like the family had simply packed up and left, but he'd made mistakes that led us to their bodies. Based on the evidence at the burial site, investigators believed the killer was someone who knew Glacier National Park extremely well. He'd chosen disposal locations that were expertly concealed and highly unlikely to be discovered by casual hikers or even experienced searchers. The case took an even more disturbing turn when forensic anthropologists began examining the older graves. They found skeletal remains representing at least 8 other individuals, indicating that this killer had been operating in the area for possibly 5 years or more. The FBI brought in additional resources and began a systematic investigation of all missing person cases in the Glacier area going back 15 years. What they discovered was a disturbing pattern of disappearances that had previously been attributed to hiking accidents or people getting lost in the wilderness. Most of the victims were families or small groups who were camping in remote backcountry areas. They'd simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of what had happened to them. When investigators re-examined these cold cases with the knowledge that a serial killer was operating in the area, a clear pattern emerged. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that one person had been present in the Glacier area during several of the disappearances. A local hunting and fishing guide named David Johnson, who had permits to operate in the national forest areas adjacent to the park. Johnson was a well-known figure in the local community who had been guiding hunters, fishermen, and wildlife photographers in the greater Glacier ecosystem for over 20 years. He had an excellent reputation, extensive knowledge of the wilderness, and legitimate reasons to be in remote areas where the disappearances had occurred. But when FBI agents began questioning Johnson about his whereabouts during the times of various disappearances, his alibis started to fall apart. He also had access to vehicles and equipment that would have made it possible for him to transport bodies to remote burial sites without being detected. The case against Johnson was built slowly and carefully over several months. Investigators found evidence that he'd been stalking potential victims, learning their camping routines and schedules before striking when they were most isolated and vulnerable. The investigation revealed that Johnson had created an elaborate fantasy about being the ultimate predator in the wilderness. He saw himself as a hunter of human beings, using his extensive knowledge of the backcountry and his reputation as a guide to avoid suspicion while selecting and stalking his victims. Johnson had been particularly attracted to families camping in remote areas because he enjoyed the psychological impact of destroying entire family units. He would observe families for days before attacking, learning their routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike when they were isolated from any potential help. When Johnson was finally arrested at his home near the park boundary, he initially denied any involvement in the disappearances. But when confronted with physical evidence linking him to several of the crime scenes, he eventually confessed to killing the Mitchell family and 9 other groups of campers over a 7-year period. "I wanted to prove that I was the apex predator in these mountains. he told investigators during his confession. I could track anyone, anywhere, and they'd never know I was coming until it was too late. Johnson's trial was held in federal court because the crimes had occurred on federal land. The prosecution presented evidence that he'd murdered a total of 28 people, including several children, in what they described as one of the most extensive serial killing sprees in the history of America's national parks. During the trial, we learned the horrifying details of how Johnson had carried out his crimes. He would follow families into remote camping areas, sometimes for days, studying their routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity to attack. He carried out the murders quickly and efficiently, then transported the bodies to burial sites he'd prepared in advance. Johnson was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He's currently on death row at a federal prison, though his appeals are still working their way through the courts. The case had a profound impact on how Glacier National Park approaches visitor safety in backcountry areas. We now require all overnight campers to carry satellite communication devices and check in at designated times. We've also significantly increased ranger patrols in remote areas. But the psychological impact on the park staff was enormous and lasting. For years, we'd been telling families that Glacier was a safe place to experience wilderness and wildlife, while warning them about natural dangers like bears, weather, and difficult terrain. We'd never imagined that someone was systematically hunting and killing our visitors. The hardest part for me personally was thinking about all the times I'd interacted with David Johnson over the years. He'd seemed like a knowledgeable, helpful local guide who genuinely cared about the wilderness and wildlife. I'd recommended his services to visitors and had even participated in search efforts where he'd volunteered his expertise. The case also made me realize how vulnerable people become when they're camping in remote wilderness areas. The Mitchell family had done everything right according to all our safety guidelines. They'd filed proper permits, carried appropriate equipment, stayed in designated camping areas, and had extensive wilderness experience. But none of that protected them from a predator who was specifically targeting people exactly like them. I still work as a park ranger at Glacier, but I approach the job very differently now. I'm much more suspicious of people I encounter in remote areas, especially those who seem overly interested in the activities and plans of other visitors. I pay much closer attention to reports of unusual activities or people behaving strangely in backcountry areas. The case also made me an advocate for requiring satellite communicators for all backcountry camping, not just as conveniences but as critical safety measures. If the Mitchell family had been carrying emergency communication devices, they might have been able to call for help when Johnson first approached their campsite. What bothers me most about the Johnson case is realizing that he could have continued his killing spree for many more years if we hadn't found the Mitchell family's bodies when we did. He was extremely careful and methodical, and he understood how to use the vastness and isolation of wilderness areas to hide his crimes. The families of Johnson's victims have filed lawsuits against the National Park Service, claiming that we should have recognized the pattern of disappearances sooner. When you visit a national park, you trust that we're doing everything possible to keep you safe. The Johnson case taught us that we need to consider threats that we'd previously thought were impossible. The case led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies share information about missing persons in wilderness areas. There's now a national database that specifically tracks disappearances in parks and forests, with algorithms designed to detect patterns that might indicate criminal activity rather than accidents. We've also dramatically improved our training for recognizing signs that a disappearance might be the result of foul play rather than natural causes. Rangers now know to look for specific indicators that might suggest a crime scene has been staged to look like an accident. I often think about Susan and Charles Mitchell and their children, Michael and Patricia, and what their final hours must have been like. They'd come to Glacier to spend quality time together as a family, to experience some of the most beautiful wilderness in America and create positive memories. Susan Mitchell was a high school English teacher who loved introducing her students to literature about the American West. Charles was a civil engineer who had worked on several major infrastructure projects. Their children were honor students who were active in outdoor clubs and environmental organizations at their schools. They were good people who didn't deserve what happened to them, but their deaths weren't meaningless if they help us protect other families from similar fates. The investigation into their murders led to the capture of a serial killer who might have continued murdering innocent visitors for years. The investigation also revealed that Johnson had been escalating his crimes over time. His early victims had been solo hikers or couples, but he'd gradually moved on to targeting larger groups and families with children. If we hadn't caught him when we did, there's no telling how many more people he might have killed. I've spoken at law enforcement conferences about the lessons learned from the Johnson case. The goal is to help other rangers and police officers recognize similar patterns before they result in multiple victims. Every time I tell this story, I hope it might prevent another family from experiencing the tragedy that befell the Mitchells. I want to emphasize that cases like the Johnson murders are extremely rare. Millions of people visit Glacier and other national parks every year, and the vast majority have safe, enjoyable experiences. The statistical chances of encountering a serial killer in the wilderness remain infinitesimally small. But they're not zero, and that's something that both park visitors and law enforcement personnel need to acknowledge and prepare for. We can't let fear keep us out of the wilderness, but we need to be smart and realistic about the full range of potential dangers. If you're planning a backcountry camping trip, please take the time to file detailed itineraries with both park authorities and trusted family members. Carry satellite communication devices or personal locator beacons, especially if you're traveling in areas without cell phone coverage. Stay aware of your surroundings and trust your instincts if something doesn't feel right. And if you're a parent planning to take children into remote wilderness areas, have age-appropriate conversations with them about safety procedures and what to do if they encounter strangers in the backcountry. Most people you'll meet on trails are fellow outdoor enthusiasts who pose no threat, but children should understand the importance of staying close to family.